Welcome to our channel, where we slow history down and gently explore the forgotten systems, routines, and lives that shaped the modern world. Tonight, we begin a long journey into how crime and punishment worked in Victorian London, from the earliest forms of policing to the grim realities of courts, prisons, and public justice. This story will unfold gradually, revealing how fear, poverty, order, and control shaped everyday life in one of the largest and most unequal cities in history. You'll hear about criminals and constables, laws and loopholes, punishment and survival, all woven into the rhythm of Victorian London. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and like this video. It helps us continue creating long, calm history stories like this one. And please comment below from which location you're watching. We truly enjoy reading where our listeners are joining us from around the world. Victorian London was a city of sharp contrasts. Grand buildings and gaslit streets stood beside dark alleys and overcrowded slums. Wealth and poverty existed side by side, and where poverty thrived, crime followed closely behind. For many Londoners, crime was not driven by greed or malice, but by hunger, desperation, and the constant struggle to survive. Stealing food, clothing, or coal was often a matter of necessity rather than choice. Yet the law did not always see it that way. The Victorian legal system was strict, moralistic, and often unforgiving, shaped by the belief that order must be maintained at all costs. At the beginning of the Victorian era, London did not have a professional police force as we understand it today. Law enforcement was fragmented and inconsistent. Night watchmen patrolled certain areas, often elderly men with little training, more likely to nap than to chase criminals. Parish constables existed, but they were usually unpaid or poorly paid, and many lacked motivation or authority. Crime was handled locally, unevenly, and often inefficiently. This lack of structure allowed theft, violence, and disorder to flourish, especially in densely populated areas. The city itself was a breeding ground for crime. London's population exploded during the Industrial Revolution, swelling with migrants from the countryside seeking work. Housing could not keep up. Families crowded into single rooms, sanitation was poor, and disease spread easily. In these conditions, theft was common. Pickpockets worked busy markets and streets. Burglars targeted homes at night. Gangs formed in poorer districts, especially among young men and boys, who saw crime as their only opportunity for income and belonging. Victorian society viewed crime through a moral lens. Criminals were often seen as morally corrupt, weak-willed, or sinful. This belief influenced how punishment was designed. The goal was not only to stop crime, but to deter others through fear and example. Public punishment played a key role in this system. Executions, floggings, and public humiliations were meant to send a clear message: break the law, and you will suffer. Public executions were still common at the start of the Victorian era. Crowds gathered to watch hangings, treating them as public spectacles. Vendors sold food. Children sat on shoulders, and the condemned were paraded before the public. These events were meant to terrify, but they often became grim entertainment. Over time, reformers began to argue that such spectacles hardened society rather than improving it, and that public punishment failed to reduce crime. As crime continued to rise, pressure mounted for reform. One of the most important changes came in 1829, just before Queen Victoria's reign began, with the creation of the Metropolitan Police. For the first time, London had a centralized, professional police force. Officers, often called bobbies, were uniformed, paid, and trained to patrol the streets regularly. Their presence alone began to change the city's atmosphere. Crime did not disappear, but it became more visible, more recorded, and more regulated. Early police officers were not universally welcomed. Many working-class Londoners distrusted them, seeing police as tools of the wealthy used to control the poor. Officers were sometimes attacked, mocked, or ignored. It took time for policing to become accepted as a necessary part of urban life. Gradually, as crime became more organized and violent, public opinion began to shift. The police were seen less as intruders and more as protectors, though this trust was never complete. Arrests led offenders into a legal system that was rigid and intimidating. Victorian courts were formal, hierarchical places where judges held immense power. Trials were often swift, and defendants, especially the poor, rarely had legal representation. Evidence standards were inconsistent, and social class heavily influenced outcomes. A wealthy defendant might receive leniency, while a poor offender could face severe punishment for the same crime. Punishment during this period was harsh by modern standards. Theft could result in years of imprisonment, transportation to penal colonies, or even death in earlier decades. Children were not spared. Young offenders could be imprisoned alongside adults or sent to reformatories that were often little better than prisons. The belief was that strict discipline would correct behavior, even if it caused suffering. Prisons themselves were undergoing change. Earlier prisons were chaotic, overcrowded, and violent. Prisoners mixed freely, spreading disease and criminal knowledge alike. Reformers began to argue that prisons should punish through isolation and reflection, rather than brutality. This led to the development of new prison designs focused on silence, separation, and constant surveillance. The idea was that solitude would force prisoners to confront their crimes and emerge reformed. Despite these intentions, prison life remained grim. Food was scarce and bland, work was hard and repetitive, and discipline was severe. Silence was enforced for hours or even days at a time. Mental illness was common among prisoners, though rarely acknowledged or treated. For many, prison did not reform, it broke them. Crime, policing, and punishment were deeply intertwined with class. The laws of Victorian London were written primarily by and for the upper classes. Vagrancy laws criminalized homelessness. Debt could land someone in prison. Public drunkenness, loitering, and petty theft were aggressively prosecuted, while crimes committed by the wealthy, such as financial fraud, were often handled more discreetly or leniently. Yet even within this harsh system, voices of reform grew louder. Journalists, writers, and social reformers exposed the realities of crime and punishment to the public. They wrote about overcrowded prisons, unjust trials, and the conditions that pushed people into crime in the first place. These voices did not yet change everything, but they planted seeds that would later reshape the system. As the Victorian era progressed, crime became more documented, more studied, and more feared. New types of crime emerged alongside industrialization: organized theft, professional burglary, and later more complex financial crimes. The system of policing and punishment struggled to keep pace, constantly adapting but never fully resolving the deeper causes of crime. Victorian London after dark was a city transformed. As daylight faded and gas lamps flickered into life, the streets took on a different rhythm. Quieter in the wealthier districts, but restless and unpredictable in the poorer ones. Crime did not simply vanish at night. For many, it truly began then. This was the world the early police officers stepped into, armed with little more than a uniform, a whistle, and their authority. Understanding how crime and punishment worked in Victorian London means understanding the daily realities of policing before modern technology, forensic science, or reliable communication existed. The Metropolitan Police were expected to patrol their assigned beats on foot, walking the same routes night after night. Familiarity was essential. Officers learned every alley, doorway, and shortcut, as well as the faces of residents who lived and worked along their route. A good constable was observant, calm under pressure, and able to read the subtle signs of trouble: an open door where one should not be, a broken window, a group lingering too long in the shadows. There were no radios to call for backup, no cameras to record events. If something went wrong, an officer relied on his voice, his whistle, or the hope that another officer was nearby. Policing was dangerous work. Officers faced assaults, ambushes, and retaliation, particularly in areas where criminal gangs operated. Some criminals saw police as enemies, others as obstacles to be bribed or avoided. In the poorest districts, residents often distrusted the police, believing they served the interests of the wealthy rather than the community. Officers were sometimes met with silence or hostility when investigating crimes, making their job even more difficult. Yet over time, some constables earned respect by resolving disputes, protecting residents, and maintaining a visible presence. Crime itself was varied and widespread. Theft was the most common offense, ranging from petty pickpocketing to organized burglary. Pickpockets worked in pairs or groups, often using distraction techniques perfected over years. One child might bump into a victim while another slipped a hand into a pocket. Burglars studied houses carefully, learning when residents were away and how to enter quietly. Some specialized in breaking locks, others in climbing or forcing windows. Stolen goods were quickly passed to fences, middlemen who resold items through markets or secondhand shops. Violent crime was less common than theft, but more feared. Assaults often occurred in pubs, alleyways, or crowded neighborhoods, where tempers flared and alcohol flowed freely. Domestic violence was widespread, but rarely treated as a serious crime, unless it resulted in severe injury or death. Murder, though relatively rare, shocked the public deeply and drew intense attention from both police and newspapers. Each major case fueled fears that crime was spiraling out of control, even when statistics suggested otherwise. Investigating crime in Victorian London required patience, intuition, and local knowledge. There were no fingerprints, DNA tests, or surveillance footage. Evidence came from witness statements, physical clues, and confessions, often unreliable. Witnesses could be mistaken, biased, or afraid to speak. Physical evidence was limited to items like footprints, bloodstains, or stolen property found in a suspect's possession. Confessions were sometimes coerced through pressure or intimidation, raising serious questions about justice and fairness. The rise of newspapers transformed crime into public spectacle. Sensational reporting turned criminals into notorious figures, and police investigations into ongoing dramas, followed by thousands of readers. Detailed descriptions of crimes, suspects, and trials filled daily papers. This coverage increased public fear, but also pressured the police to solve cases quickly. A failure to catch a criminal, especially in high-profile cases, damaged public confidence and fueled criticism of law enforcement. One of the most significant challenges facing Victorian police was the lack of coordination. Although the Metropolitan Police provided centralized oversight, communication between officers was slow. Messages were delivered by foot or horseback. Information about suspects or crimes could take days to spread across districts. Criminals exploited these gaps, moving between neighborhoods to avoid detection. Some even crossed city boundaries, knowing police jurisdictions were limited. Once a suspect was arrested, the journey through the justice system began. Police stations served as holding areas where prisoners awaited questioning and court appearances. Conditions were basic and often uncomfortable. Suspects could be held for limited periods, but overcrowding was common. Interrogations relied heavily on questioning rather than evidence. Officers were trained to observe inconsistencies in stories and pressure suspects into admissions, sometimes crossing ethical boundaries. Courts were intimidating spaces, especially for the poor. Proceedings were formal, rapid, and often confusing to those unfamiliar with legal language. Magistrates wielded significant power, deciding whether cases would proceed to higher courts or be resolved quickly with fines or short sentences. For minor crimes, punishment could be immediate. For serious offenses, defendants faced trial before judges and juries who often shared the values and biases of the upper classes. The concept of fairness was unevenly applied. A well-dressed defendant who spoke confidently might be viewed more favorably than a poorly clothed laborer struggling to explain himself. Character witnesses played a role, but poor defendants rarely had anyone willing or able to speak on their behalf. Legal representation was costly and uncommon for working-class people, leaving many to face the system alone. Punishment reflected Victorian beliefs about discipline and deterrence. The idea was simple: make the consequences severe enough to discourage crime. Imprisonment was common, but so were fines, corporal punishment, and in earlier decades, transportation to distant colonies. Even as some reforms softened the harshest penalties, the underlying philosophy remained strict. Criminals were expected to suffer for their actions, both as retribution and as a lesson to others. Prisons, increasingly central to the punishment system, were designed to enforce control and conformity. Silence was considered essential. Prisoners marched in single file, heads down, speaking only when permitted. Work was mandatory and repetitive: breaking stones, turning treadwheels, or picking oakum. The intention was to instill discipline and reflection, but the result was often psychological damage. Isolation led to anxiety, depression, and breakdowns, though these outcomes were poorly understood at the time. Not all crimes were treated equally. Property crimes against the wealthy were punished more harshly than violence within poor communities. Laws protected goods and money with particular intensity, reflecting the priorities of those who wrote them. At the same time, crimes committed by employers, such as exploiting workers or ignoring safety standards, were rarely punished with the same severity, even when they caused injury or death. Despite the rigidity of the system, cracks began to appear. Reformers questioned whether harsh punishment truly reduced crime or merely recycled offenders through prisons. They argued that poverty, lack of education, and overcrowding were the real causes of criminal behavior. Some suggested that rehabilitation, not fear, should be the goal. These ideas were controversial and slow to gain acceptance, but they marked the beginning of a shift in thinking. The police themselves were changing as well. Training improved gradually, discipline tightened, and standards rose. Corruption, while never eliminated, became less tolerated. Officers were expected to embody respectability and restraint, reinforcing the image of the police as guardians of order rather than instruments of oppression. This transformation was uneven and incomplete, but it reshaped public perceptions over time. Crime and punishment in Victorian London were not static systems. They evolved in response to social pressure, public fear, and political debate. Each reform addressed one problem while revealing another. Policing became more organized, yet crime adapted. Punishment became less public, yet no less severe. The tension between control and compassion, order and justice, ran through every aspect of the system. As the city continued to grow, so did the complexity of crime. New forms of wrongdoing emerged alongside new methods of enforcement. The struggle between criminals and the authorities became an ongoing contest, shaped by technology, economics, and human behavior. Understanding this struggle means looking beyond laws and institutions to the lives of ordinary people caught within them. Prisons in Victorian London were designed not merely to confine the body, but to reshape the mind. By the time Queen Victoria came to the throne, imprisonment had become the central tool of punishment, replacing many of the public and physical penalties of earlier centuries. Yet while the gallows and the whipping post slowly faded from everyday use, the prison emerged as a quieter, more controlled, and often more psychologically damaging instrument of justice. To understand how crime and punishment truly worked in Victorian London, one must step inside these institutions and experience the logic that governed them. Early Victorian prisons were grim places. Many had been converted from older buildings never intended to hold large numbers of people. Cells were small, dark, and poorly ventilated. Prisoners slept on hard boards or thin straw mattresses, often sharing space with rats and insects. Clean water was limited, sanitation was poor, and disease spread quickly. Typhus, cholera, and tuberculosis were common, and death in custody was not unusual. For many prisoners, survival itself became the primary challenge. Reformers believed that chaos inside prisons contributed to crime outside them. In earlier systems, prisoners mingled freely, sharing stories, skills, and criminal knowledge. A first-time offender might leave prison more dangerous than when they entered. To solve this, Victorian thinkers embraced the idea of separation. Isolation, they believed, would force prisoners to reflect on their crimes and emerge morally improved. From this belief came the separate system, one of the most influential and controversial prison philosophies of the era. Under the separate system, prisoners were kept in solitary confinement for most or all of their sentence. They worked alone, ate alone, and slept alone. Even during exercise or chapel services, prisoners wore hoods to prevent them from seeing one another. Silence was enforced strictly. The intention was spiritual reform, time alone with one's conscience, Bible and thoughts. In reality, many prisoners experienced intense loneliness, anxiety, and mental breakdowns. Records from the period describe hallucinations, emotional collapse, and suicide attempts, though these outcomes were often dismissed or ignored by authorities. An alternative approach, known as the silent system, allowed prisoners to work together during the day but forbade all speech. Silence was enforced through strict discipline and harsh punishment. Guards watched constantly, ready to respond to any whispered word or gesture. While this system avoided total isolation, it still placed enormous psychological strain on inmates. Human connection was denied, and communication became an act of defiance. Daily life in prison followed a rigid schedule. Prisoners woke early, often before dawn. Meals were simple and bland: bread, gruel, and occasionally vegetables or meat. Portions were intentionally small, reinforcing the idea that prison should not be comfortable. Work occupied most of the day. Tasks were deliberately repetitive and exhausting, designed less to produce useful goods and more to instill discipline. Treadwheels forced prisoners to walk endlessly without going anywhere. Oakum picking, tearing apart old rope, left hands raw and bleeding. Stone breaking served no purpose beyond punishment. Rules were absolute, and infractions were met with swift consequences. Talking, disobedience, or laziness could result in solitary confinement, reduced rations, or physical punishment. Although corporal punishment declined over the Victorian period, it did not disappear. Whippings were still used, particularly for violent offenders or those who resisted authority. Discipline was justified as necessary to maintain order and prevent rebellion. Children and young offenders were not exempt from imprisonment. Though reformatories and industrial schools were later developed, many young people still passed through adult prisons, exposed to the same harsh routines. The belief that discipline would correct behavior applied equally to children, despite growing evidence that imprisonment often hardened rather than reformed them. Some reformers argued that young offenders required education and guidance, but change came slowly. Women's prisons reflected both punishment and moral judgment. Female prisoners were often incarcerated for crimes linked to poverty, prostitution, theft, drunkenness. They were subjected to strict rules emphasizing modesty, obedience, and moral reform. Work typically involved laundry, sewing, or domestic tasks, reinforcing Victorian ideals of womanhood. Pregnant women and mothers were imprisoned as well, sometimes giving birth behind bars. Their children might remain with them briefly or be sent to workhouses, beginning a cycle of institutional life from birth. Despite the harshness of prison life, not all officials agreed on its effectiveness. Reports began to surface showing high rates of reoffending. Prison did not solve the underlying causes of crime: poverty, unemployment, overcrowding, and lack of education. Many prisoners left with fewer opportunities than before, marked by stigma and limited prospects. The system punished, but it did not heal. Outside prison walls, public attitudes toward punishment were slowly shifting. Executions moved behind closed doors, reducing their role as public spectacle. Transportation to penal colonies declined. There was growing discomfort with cruelty, even as fear of crime remained strong. Writers, journalists, and reformers documented prison conditions, exposing their realities to the wider public. Their work sparked debate about whether punishment should focus on retribution or rehabilitation. At the same time, the state expanded its reach. Prisons became more standardized, inspected, and regulated. Record-keeping improved. Prisoners were classified by offense and behavior. The system became more bureaucratic, more controlled, and more impersonal. This efficiency reduced some abuses, but also reinforced the idea that prisoners were numbers to be managed, rather than individuals to be understood. For those who passed through these institutions, the experience left lasting scars. Time moved slowly. Days blended together. Silence, repetition, and isolation reshaped identities. Some prisoners emerged, determined never to return. Others, broken by the system, found themselves unable to survive outside it, and returned again and again. Prison became a revolving door rather than a final solution. Crime and punishment in Victorian London were deeply connected to ideas of morality, order, and fear. Prisons embodied these ideas in brick, iron, and routine. They reflected a society struggling to control rapid change, using discipline to impose stability. Yet beneath the rules and structures lay human lives, complex, desperate, and often misunderstood. Courtrooms in Victorian London were places where power, class, and morality converged. They were not designed to feel welcoming or fair, especially to the poor. High ceilings, elevated benches, and rigid procedures reinforced the authority of judges and the seriousness of the law. For many defendants, simply standing inside a courtroom was overwhelming. The language was formal, the rules were strict, and the outcome could alter the course of a life forever. Justice in theory was blind, but in practice, it often saw wealth, status, and respectability very clearly. Most criminal cases began in magistrates' courts. These were local courts that handled minor offenses and decided whether serious cases should proceed to higher courts. Magistrates were often middle or upper-class men, sometimes with little formal legal training. They wielded immense discretion. A defendant's appearance, speech, and perceived character could heavily influence decisions. A well-dressed, articulate person might receive a fine or warning, while a poorly clothed laborer could be sent to prison for the same offense. Proceedings were usually swift. Defendants rarely had legal representation. Lawyers were expensive, and legal aid did not exist in the way it does today. Many accused people stood alone, trying to defend themselves against charges they barely understood. Evidence was presented quickly, often based on witness testimony that could be biased, mistaken, or incomplete. The idea of innocent until proven guilty existed in principle, but in practice, suspicion alone could be enough to secure a conviction. For serious crimes, cases moved to higher courts, such as the Old Bailey. These trials attracted public attention and newspaper coverage. Courtrooms were crowded with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers. Trials became performances as much as legal processes. Judges wore imposing robes and wigs, symbols of tradition and authority. Juries, made up entirely of men and usually drawn from property-owning classes, were expected to determine guilt or innocence, but their judgments were shaped by the values and prejudices of their time. The role of the jury was complex. In theory, it provided a safeguard against abuse of power. In reality, juries often sympathized more with victims than with defendants, especially when the accused came from the poorest districts. Crimes against property were taken particularly seriously. Stealing from a shop or employer was seen not only as a crime, but as a moral failing. Violence within families or among the poor, however, was sometimes dismissed as unfortunate but inevitable. Sentencing reflected these attitudes. Judges had wide latitude in determining punishment. They considered the crime, the defendant's past, and their perceived moral character. Repeat offenders were punished harshly, reinforcing a cycle in which poverty and prior convictions led to ever-increasing sentences. Transportation to penal colonies, once common, declined over the Victorian period, but long prison sentences filled the gap. For some offenses, particularly in earlier decades, the death penalty still loomed, though it was applied more selectively over time. Public opinion played an influential role. Newspapers reported trials in vivid detail, shaping perceptions of crime and justice. Sensational cases fueled fear and outrage, pressuring courts to appear firm and decisive. At the same time, reports of miscarriages of justice, wrongful convictions, excessive sentences, sparked debate and calls for reform. The courtroom became a battleground not only for defendants, but for competing ideas about punishment, responsibility, and fairness. Women faced particular challenges in the legal system. Female defendants were judged not only for their crimes, but for their conformity to Victorian ideals of womanhood. Those accused of prostitution, theft, or drunkenness were often portrayed as morally fallen, deserving of punishment not just for breaking the law, but for violating social norms. Conversely, women who appeared modest, repentant, or respectable sometimes received leniency. Justice was deeply entangled with expectations of gender. Children, too, were processed through the courts, often with little understanding of the proceedings. Young defendants stood before magistrates and judges who believed discipline was the best teacher. While reformatories and juvenile courts emerged later in the century, many children were still tried and sentenced much like adults. Their youth might mitigate punishment, but it did not shield them from the system's harshness. The courts also played a role in reinforcing social order beyond crime. Laws against vagrancy, loitering, and public drunkenness allowed authorities to control the movement and behavior of the poor. These offenses were easy to prosecute and carried penalties that kept people cycling through courts and prisons. The legal system became a mechanism for managing poverty, rather than addressing its causes. Despite its rigidity, the Victorian legal system was not static. Gradual reforms improved procedures, evidence standards, and defendants' rights. The use of lawyers increased, jury selection evolved, and some punishments were softened. Yet progress was uneven. Old attitudes lingered, and the gap between law in theory and law in practice remained wide. For those who passed through the courts, the experience was often confusing and frightening. Decisions were made quickly, lives altered in minutes. The system valued order and authority above understanding or compassion. It was efficient, powerful, and deeply flawed, reflecting a society struggling to balance control with justice in an age of rapid change. For many offenders in Victorian London, sentencing was not the end of the ordeal. It was the beginning of a long and uncertain struggle to survive the consequences of punishment. Once a judge delivered a sentence, the individual's future followed one of several paths: imprisonment, transportation in earlier decades, hard labor, or eventual release back into society. Each path carried its own hardships, and none offered an easy return to ordinary life. Transportation, though declining during Queen Victoria's reign, still cast a long shadow over the justice system. For decades, convicts had been sent thousands of miles away to penal colonies such as Australia. The punishment was severe not only because of the labor involved, but because it severed all ties to home. Families were torn apart permanently. For those sentenced to transportation, London vanished behind them, often forever. Although the practice gradually ended by the mid-19th century, its legacy lingered in public fear and memory, shaping how people understood punishment and exile. For prisoners who served time and were released, freedom was fragile. A criminal record followed them everywhere, though it was not formalized in modern terms. Employers were reluctant to hire former prisoners, landlords refused housing, and communities treated them with suspicion. Even minor convictions could permanently mark a person as untrustworthy. Without work or shelter, many former prisoners drifted back into poverty, the very condition that had led them into crime in the first place. The stigma of imprisonment was especially harsh in Victorian society, which valued respectability above almost everything else. A single conviction could destroy a reputation beyond repair. This was particularly devastating for working-class individuals whose survival depended on daily labor and community trust. A man released from prison might find every door closed to him. A woman, especially one convicted of theft or prostitution, faced social exile that left few alternatives outside crime or the workhouse. Charitable organizations attempted to address this problem. Some reformers believed that rehabilitation required support, not just punishment. Prison aid societies emerged, offering basic assistance, temporary lodging, food, sometimes help finding employment. Religious groups emphasized repentance and moral reform, hoping to guide former offenders toward respectable lives. These efforts helped some, but resources were limited, and the scale of need far exceeded what charity could provide. Life after prison was further complicated by the conditions inside prisons themselves. Many prisoners emerged, physically weakened and mentally scarred. Years of silence, isolation, and monotonous labor left lasting effects. Some struggled with anxiety, depression, or an inability to function independently. The system expected them to reintegrate smoothly, yet offered little preparation or support. Failure was often interpreted as proof that the individual was beyond redemption, reinforcing harsh attitudes. Women faced distinct challenges upon release. Female prisoners were often sent back into the same environments that had led to their arrest: poverty, exploitation, unstable housing. Employment opportunities for women were already limited, and a criminal past narrowed them further. Domestic service was one of the few options available, but employers demanded spotless reputations. Many women found themselves trapped between social expectations and economic reality, with little room to rebuild their lives. Children released from reformatories or prisons encountered similar obstacles. Though reformers argued that youth could be redirected, society offered few opportunities for young offenders to start anew. Many returned to overcrowded homes or the streets, carrying the weight of institutional life into adulthood. The cycle of arrest, punishment, and release often repeated. not because of inherent criminality, but because of structural neglect. The workhouse loomed as an alternative for those who could not survive independently. For former prisoners, it was both refuge and threat. Entering a workhouse meant food and shelter, but at the cost of freedom and dignity. Families were separated, labor was compulsory, and conditions were harsh. For many, the workhouse felt like another form of imprisonment, reinforcing the sense that once marked by the system, escape was nearly impossible. Public attitudes toward former criminals were shaped by fear and moral judgment. Newspapers rarely followed up on what happened after sentencing. Stories ended at conviction, leaving the public with an image of crime neatly resolved. The reality, that punishment often failed to reduce crime and instead perpetuated suffering, remained largely hidden. Reformers continued to argue that without addressing poverty, education, and housing, punishment alone could never create safety or justice. Over time, some changes began to take hold. Discussions about probation, conditional release, and rehabilitation gained momentum toward the end of the Victorian era. The idea that society shared responsibility for crime, not just individuals, slowly entered public debate. These ideas did not yet transform the system, but they challenged the belief that punishment alone was enough. For the people living through it, however, the system remained unforgiving. Crime and punishment in Victorian London extended far beyond arrest and sentencing. They shaped entire lives, families, and neighborhoods. The law did not simply punish acts. It defined who could belong and who would remain forever on the margins. Some crimes in Victorian London did more than fill court records. They unsettled the entire city. These were the cases that haunted newspapers, fueled rumors, and reshaped public fear. While theft and assault were everyday realities, certain crimes pierced the Victorian sense of order so deeply that they became symbols of everything dangerous and uncontrollable about urban life. These infamous cases revealed not only the brutality of crime, but also the limitations of policing, the fragility of justice, and the anxieties of a rapidly changing society. Murder was the crime Victorians feared most, not because it was common, but because it shattered the illusion that the city could be controlled. When a body was discovered, especially in a poor district, panic spread quickly. Streets filled with gossip, suspicion, and dread. Neighbors eyed one another warily. Police investigations drew crowds, and newspapers rushed to publish every detail, accurate or not. Each murder became a public event, followed obsessively by readers across social classes. The most notorious crimes often occurred in the poorest neighborhoods, where overcrowding and poverty already bred anxiety. Narrow streets, dim lighting, and transient populations made these areas difficult to police and easy to fear. When violence struck, it confirmed middle-class fears about slums as places of moral decay. At the same time, it intensified pressure on the police to demonstrate competence and authority. Investigations into major crimes exposed the weaknesses of Victorian policing. Without forensic science, detectives relied on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and intuition. Mistakes were common. Suspects were arrested on flimsy evidence, interrogated aggressively, and sometimes convicted despite doubts. When crimes went unsolved, public confidence eroded. The idea that criminals could vanish into the city terrified Victorians, who increasingly saw London as too large, too complex, and too anonymous to control. Newspapers played a central role in shaping this fear. Sensational headlines transformed criminals into monsters and detectives into heroes or failures. Detailed descriptions of crime scenes, victims, and suspects blurred the line between reporting and storytelling. Readers followed investigations as serialized dramas, speculating about motives and identities. This coverage increased pressure on police to act decisively, sometimes at the expense of careful justice. These infamous cases also influenced public attitudes toward punishment. Calls for harsher sentences grew louder after shocking crimes. Some argued that leniency encouraged lawlessness, while others insisted that brutality failed to prevent violence. Each high-profile case reignited debates about deterrence, rehabilitation, and the purpose of punishment. The justice system was constantly pulled between fear-driven demands for severity and reform-driven calls for humanity. Fear of crime affected everyday behavior. People avoided certain streets, altered routines, and locked doors more carefully. Women, in particular, were warned to stay vigilant, reinforcing gendered ideas about vulnerability and danger. The city's geography became moralized. Some areas were seen as respectable, others as inherently criminal. This division deepened social distance and justified unequal treatment by police and courts. Infamous crimes also revealed how deeply class influenced justice. When victims were wealthy or respectable, investigations were thorough and highly publicized. When victims were poor, attention faded more quickly. Crimes against marginalized people, especially women, the homeless, or immigrants, were often minimized or forgotten. Justice was not equally urgent for all, reinforcing the sense that the law served some lives more than others. Despite fear and sensationalism, these cases sometimes sparked reform. Public outrage over investigative failures led to improvements in policing methods. Record-keeping became more systematic. Detective work gained status and structure. Slowly, the idea emerged that understanding crime required studying patterns, environments, and motives, not just punishing offenders. These shifts marked early steps toward modern criminology. Yet, even as methods improved, fear remained a powerful force. Crime stories became part of Victorian culture, shaping literature, conversation, and identity. They reflected deeper anxieties about urbanization, anonymity, and social change. Criminals were seen not just as individuals, but as symbols of a city struggling to contain itself. For ordinary Londoners, these infamous cases were reminders that crime and punishment were not distant systems. They were forces that could reach into any home, any street, any life. The justice system, with all its authority, could not guarantee safety or fairness. It could only respond, often imperfectly, to the consequences of deeper social problems. As the Victorian era moved toward its end, the balance between fear and reform continued to shift. Crime did not disappear, but the ways it was understood began to change. The focus slowly expanded, from punishment alone to prevention, from spectacle to study, from moral judgment to social responsibility. As we come to the end of this long journey through crime and punishment in Victorian London, it becomes clear that the system was never just about law-breaking and discipline. It was a reflection of a society struggling to manage rapid change, overwhelming growth, and deep inequality. The streets, courts, prisons, and police stations of Victorian London formed a vast mechanism designed to impose order on a city that often felt uncontrollable. Yet beneath that mechanism were human lives, fragile, complex, and shaped as much by circumstance as by choice. Victorian crime was inseparable from poverty. Overcrowded housing, insecure work, hunger, and lack of education created conditions where crime became, for many, a means of survival. The justice system rarely addressed these root causes. Instead, it responded with punishment, believing that fear and discipline would preserve order. Policing grew more professional, courts more structured, and prisons more systematic. But the underlying philosophy remained focused on control rather than understanding. The creation of a modern police force marked a turning point. Regular patrols, uniforms, and centralized authority reshaped how London functioned. Crime became something to be monitored, recorded, and managed. This brought greater consistency, but also expanded the state's power over everyday life. The police became symbols of order, yet also reminders of surveillance and authority, especially in poor communities where trust remained fragile. Prisons, too, evolved into institutions of routine and isolation. They were meant to reform, but often punished without healing. Silence, separation, and labor were imposed in the belief that they would correct moral failure. Instead, many prisoners left more damaged than before, unprepared for life outside, and marked by stigma that followed them everywhere. Release did not mean freedom. It meant survival in a society unwilling to forgive. Courts reinforced social hierarchies. Justice was shaped by class, gender, and respectability. The same act could lead to different outcomes depending on who committed it and how they were perceived. Law promised fairness, but practice delivered something uneven and often harsh. Yet within this system, debates grew louder. Reformers questioned cruelty, Journalists exposed abuses, and public opinion slowly shifted. Infamous crimes intensified fear, but also forced reflection. They revealed the limits of punishment and the impossibility of absolute control. Each unsolved case, each wrongful conviction, chipped away at confidence in the system. Gradually, the idea emerged that crime could not be solved by punishment alone, that prevention, education, and social reform mattered just as much. By the end of the Victorian era, the foundations of the modern justice system were in place. Policing, prisons, and courts had become permanent features of urban life. Their flaws were evident, but so was their influence. The debates that began in Victorian London about punishment versus rehabilitation, authority versus fairness, fear versus compassion, continue today. Looking back, crime and punishment in Victorian London teach us that justice is never static. It is shaped by values, power, and the willingness to see people not just as offenders, but as products of their environment. The Victorian system sought order above all else. In doing so, it left behind lessons written in stone walls, iron bars, and quiet suffering. Lessons that still echo in the systems we live with now. And now, as the gaslights fade, and the city grows quiet once more, our story reaches its end. Good night, and may these slow reflections on history ease your thoughts and guide you gently into rest. Welcome to our channel, where we dive into the untold stories of history's darkest moments. Tonight, we're exploring a particularly grim chapter in Victorian London, the lives of children forced into exploitation and labor. Children, often from the poorest families, were pushed into work from a very young age, filling the streets and factories, all while enduring conditions that are hard to imagine today. The jobs they took on were often dangerous, grueling, and done under oppressive conditions. This video will explore the various jobs children did during this time, how they were exploited, and the emotional and physical toll it took on them. Before we dive into the details, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video to help us continue telling these important stories. We also love hearing from you, so comment below and let us know from which location you're watching this video. The Victorian era was a time of extreme contrast, great wealth and progress for some, but suffering and deprivation for many others. One of the most disturbing features of this time was the widespread exploitation of children. The rapid growth of cities and industries created a demand for cheap labor, and children were seen as the perfect workers, small, quick, and easily manipulated. Many were forced to work in dangerous conditions, often in places that were meant for adults, and they were paid a pittance for their labor. The children of London were subjected to this brutal reality, where their lives were dictated by the need to survive. In Victorian London, the Industrial Revolution had transformed the city into a bustling hub of factories, mills, and workshops. But it also created a large gap between the rich and the poor, with a growing number of families living in abject poverty. For many of these families, the workhouse was not an option, and their children had to find work in order to help make ends meet. Children as young as 5 or 6 were sent to work, often in dangerous and exhausting jobs that adults would refuse. One of the most common jobs for children in Victorian London was working in factories. Factories were some of the largest employers of child labor during the era, particularly in the textile industry. Cotton mills, wool factories, and spinning mills employed children to perform tasks that adults simply could not do because of the machine's intricate and dangerous mechanisms. Children worked long hours, often 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, operating the machinery or repairing broken parts. The work in these factories was relentless. Children were often put in charge of running the machines, or they would have to clean and maintain them while they were still in motion. The machinery in these factories was massive, and it was often dangerous. Children would get their hands or clothing caught in the machines, leading to horrific injuries or even death. There were very few safety regulations in place, and factory owners cared little for the well-being of their workers. The children were seen as expendable. Their small size allowed them to crawl between the machines and pick up the cotton or wool that fell on the floor, making them even more valuable to factory owners who wanted to minimize wasted material. These children worked in filthy and unsanitary conditions, with poor ventilation and little access to fresh air. The mills were often cramped and dark, and the air was thick with dust and fibers from the machinery. This exposure to cotton and wool dust led to lung diseases like chronic bronchitis and tuberculosis. Many children developed these diseases at an early age, and their health often deteriorated rapidly. Despite their exhaustion and deteriorating health, they were forced to keep working, as their families depended on the meager wages they brought home. Another common job for children during this time was working as chimney sweeps. This job was particularly brutal and dangerous. Boys as young as 4 or 5 were hired to climb up the narrow chimneys of homes and factories to clean the soot that built up inside. The work was physically demanding and dangerous. The children would climb up the chimneys barefoot, often using nothing but their hands to scrape away the soot. Many children became ill from inhaling the soot, and the narrow chimneys often led to accidents where children became stuck, suffocated, or fell to their deaths. Children employed as chimney sweeps were typically forced to work long hours in cramped, uncomfortable conditions. They were often locked inside chimneys for hours at a time, unable to move or stretch. This caused many children to develop physical deformities, such as spinal problems, limb deformities, and breathing issues. Many of these children were also physically abused by their employers, who used them as tools to earn money rather than considering their well-being. In addition to factory work and chimney sweeping, many poor children in Victorian London also worked as apprentices to tradesmen. These children were often bound to a tradesman from an early age, working for little or no pay in exchange for learning the trade. The work was often brutal, and children were forced to do the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs. For example, apprentice bakers were responsible for carrying large sacks of flour, tending the ovens, and cleaning the bakery. Apprentice blacksmiths would be assigned to heavy lifting, hammering metal, and working with dangerous tools. The work was often exhausting, and the children were forced to work long hours with little rest. The majority of these children lived in poor, overcrowded conditions. Many were forced to sleep in the same rooms where they worked, in homes that were barely big enough for the families who lived in them. There was little room for personal space, and hygiene was nearly non-existent. Diseases like cholera, typhus, and dysentery spread quickly in these unsanitary conditions. Many children fell ill and died before they could escape the harshness of their lives. The wealthy, on the other hand, lived in luxury, completely unaware of the suffering of the children working in the factories, chimneys, and workshops of London. They were able to send their children to school, hire servants, and enjoy comfortable lives. The inequality between the rich and the poor was vast, and the poor children were often viewed as a necessary part of the system that kept the economy running. They were seen as little more than tools, exploited for their small size and ability to work long hours. Despite the hardships, many of these children found ways to survive. They formed close-knit communities with other children who shared their struggles. For some, the streets of London became a kind of family. Children would band together, looking out for each other as they navigated the dangers of their world. They found comfort in one another's company, sharing stories, games, and, occasionally, small moments of joy. This video will continue to explore the grim reality of Victorian London's child labor system, highlighting the resilience of the children who endured unimaginable conditions. As we move forward, we'll discuss the reforms that slowly began to take shape in response to the growing awareness of child exploitation. But for now, remember the bravery and determination of the children who worked day in and day out to survive in a world that showed them little compassion. As we continue to explore the harsh realities of child labor during the Victorian era, it's important to acknowledge the growing awareness of the inhumane conditions these children faced. Over time, social reformers, activists, and even some members of the middle and upper classes began to speak out against the abuse and exploitation of children, laying the groundwork for the social reforms that would eventually improve the lives of many. However, these changes were slow, and the road to reform was long and difficult. The Factory Acts, which were introduced in the early 19th century, were some of the first pieces of legislation aimed at regulating the working conditions of children. The Factory Act of 1833 was particularly important in the history of child labor reform. It limited the working hours for children, setting the maximum at 8 hours a day for children aged 9 to 13 and 12 hours a day for those aged 14 to 18. It also required that children receive some form of education during the day. While this act was a step in the right direction, it was by no means a perfect solution. Enforcement of the laws was weak, and many factory owners found ways to circumvent the rules. In some cases, factory inspectors were bribed or simply did not have the resources to enforce the regulations effectively. As a result, many children continued to work long hours in dangerous and unhealthy conditions. One of the key figures in the campaign for reform was Lord Shaftesbury, a prominent social reformer and politician. Shaftesbury was instrumental in pushing for the Factory Acts and other pieces of legislation aimed at improving the lives of children. He was deeply moved by the plight of working children and used his position in Parliament to advocate for their rights. Through his efforts, he brought attention to the abuse of child workers, particularly in the textile industry, where children were forced to work with dangerous machinery for hours on end. Shaftesbury's work was part of a larger social reform movement that gained momentum in the 19th century. The Chartist movement, which called for universal male suffrage and better working conditions for all, also supported the idea that children should not be subjected to long hours of labor. At the same time, religious groups such as the Methodists and Anglicans began to speak out against the exploitation of children, believing that it was a moral obligation to protect the most vulnerable members of society. One of the most powerful influences on child labor reform during the Victorian era was the rise of public awareness. The stories of child workers were brought to light through books, pamphlets, and newspapers, many of which were published by social reformers or people who had witnessed the horrors firsthand. These stories often described the suffering of children in factories, mines, and other workplaces, and they shocked the public. Charles Dickens, in particular, became one of the most famous voices for children's rights during this period. His novel, Oliver Twist, was a scathing critique of the workhouse system and child labor, and it helped to raise awareness of the dire conditions faced by poor children. Dickens himself had spent part of his childhood working in a boot-blacking factory when his family fell into poverty. His experiences, coupled with his deep empathy for the poor, made him a passionate advocate for social change. Through his work, he sought to expose the systemic abuses that children were subjected to and bring about public outrage. His portrayal of the hardships faced by poor children like Oliver Twist resonated with many readers, and it helped to create a public demand for reform. Another key figure in the reform movement was Dr. Richard Peters, a physician who worked with poor children in London's slums. Peters used his medical expertise to document the effects of child labor on children's health. He published reports on the widespread diseases and injuries that children suffered in factories, and his work helped to demonstrate the physical toll that child labor took on their bodies. His research was crucial in convincing lawmakers and the public that child labor needed to be regulated more strictly. The Factory Act of 1844 was another important piece of legislation aimed at improving the lives of working children. This act raised the minimum age for factory workers to 8 years old and limited the hours that children could work. The law also mandated that children between the ages of 8 and 13 could only work for 6 hours a day. The act was seen as a major victory for child labor reformers, but it still did not go far enough in protecting children from exploitation. Many children continued to work long hours in unhealthy conditions, and the law was not always enforced properly. By the 1850s, reformers were beginning to push for even stronger laws to protect children. The Factory Act of 1856 sought to address some of the gaps in previous legislation, including establishing stricter regulations for the working conditions of children. It also required that factory owners provide basic schooling for children, although the quality of this education was often poor. The Education Act of 1870, which established compulsory education for children, was another milestone in the fight for children's rights. This act made it illegal for children under the age of 10 to work full-time without attending school. Despite the progress made through these reforms, the reality for many children in Victorian London remained grim. While the Factory Acts and education laws began to limit the hours that children could work, the need for cheap labor continued to exist. Many poor children were still forced to work in other sectors, such as coal mines, chimney sweeping, and domestic service. The government, while making some strides in addressing the issue, was often slow to respond to the realities of child exploitation. For many, the workhouse system remained a harsh and unforgiving institution, where children were subjected to long hours of labor, harsh discipline, and overcrowded conditions. However, Even in the face of these challenges, the efforts of social reformers continued to build momentum. The Public Health Act of 1875 sought to improve living conditions in the slums, addressing issues like sanitation, overcrowding, and disease. This law, along with the housing reforms of the late 19th century, helped to improve the overall quality of life for the working poor, though much work remained to be done. As the century drew to a close, the reform movement had made significant strides in improving the lives of children. The Children's Charter of 1908, which was passed in response to the growing concerns over child welfare, marked the beginning of a more comprehensive approach to child protection. This law established the juvenile courts and gave the state the power to intervene in cases of neglect and abuse. Though it took decades for the full impact of these laws to be felt, the reforms of the Victorian era set the stage for the modern child protection system that we know today. In the end, the Victorian reforms did not completely eradicate the exploitation of children, but they laid the groundwork for the progress that would follow. The tireless efforts of reformers, social activists, and writers like Dickens brought the issue of child labor into the public consciousness and created a foundation for change. Though the path to reform was long and difficult, the resilience of those who fought for the rights of children ensured that their voices were heard, leading to better laws, protections, and opportunities for future generations. As the Victorian era gave way to the 20th century, the reforms that had been slowly taking shape began to have a more lasting impact on the lives of poor children in London and beyond. The Factory Acts, the rise of public education, and the gradual improvements in living conditions had laid the groundwork for a future where children's rights were better protected. However, while these changes were significant, the road to full protection and opportunity for every child was far from smooth. The early efforts of reformers set the stage for the continuing struggle for children's welfare, but it would take decades for these reforms to be fully realized. One of the most lasting changes to come out of the Victorian reform movements was the expansion of education. The Education Act of 1870, which had made education for children up to the age of 13 compulsory, was a landmark piece of legislation, but its effects were not fully felt until the early 20th century. The law had established the framework for universal education, but it was still up to local authorities to implement it, and many poor children continued to receive inadequate schooling. The quality of education varied greatly depending on where children lived, and many working-class children were still required to work in factories, mines, or on the streets. However, as the century progressed, more and more children began to attend school. The Education Act of 1918, also known as the Fisher Act, further expanded on the work of its predecessors by increasing the school-leaving age to 14 and improving the curriculum for working-class children. This shift allowed more children, especially those from poorer families, to receive a better education, paving the way for greater opportunities later in life. Children were no longer expected to contribute to the family income at such an early age, and many began to move away from factory labor and towards skilled work and trades that required an education. At the same time, the early 20th century saw the establishment of more comprehensive child welfare programs. The Children's Charter of 1908, which had created juvenile courts and reinforced the idea that children were not miniature adults but individuals with special needs, was expanded in the early 1900s. The Children's Act of 1948 further solidified the role of social workers and the state in protecting children from neglect, abuse, and exploitation. This was a major milestone in child protection law, but it was rooted in the efforts of Victorian reformers who had worked to raise awareness about the need for child welfare laws. The rise of the welfare state in the aftermath of the Second World War had a profound effect on children's lives. The creation of the National Health Service, NHS, in 1948 ensured that all children, regardless of their family's financial status, had access to free health care. Before this, poor children were often left untreated for sicknesses and diseases, with many dying from preventable causes. The introduction of vaccinations and better hygiene standards, alongside improved medical care, led to a dramatic reduction in child mortality. This was a direct result of the earlier reforms, which had highlighted the extreme vulnerability of children and pushed for societal change. By the time the 1960s and 1970s rolled around, the social safety nets created in the Victorian era were deeply entrenched. Laws concerning child labor had largely eradicated the practice in most industries, and the overwhelming focus shifted toward children's rights. The United Nations adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, in 1989, was an international recognition of the progress made in child welfare. The CRC outlined the basic rights of children worldwide, including the right to education, protection from abuse, and participation in decisions that affect their lives. Though the Victorian reforms had been national in scope, the CRC set a global standard for children's protection that influenced laws and policies across the world. The foundation laid by the Victorian reformers also influenced the rise of social movements in the 20th century. As industrialization continued, the plight of the poor, especially children, remained at the forefront of many political debates. Movements advocating for workers' rights, equal education, and equal access to health care drew upon the work of earlier reformers who had fought for children's rights. While child labor had been officially abolished in most industries, exploitation continued in other forms, such as child trafficking and the use of children in war. These new forms of exploitation led to the development of international human rights frameworks that focused specifically on the welfare of children, continuing the fight for equality and justice that began in the Victorian era. The reformers of the Victorian era were also the pioneers of the idea that poverty and social inequality were factors that contributed to the exploitation of children. The education reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries helped to break the cycle of poverty by giving children the tools they needed to lift themselves out of it. But even as education became more accessible, the issue of poverty remained a serious problem. Families who lived in slums or had low-paying jobs continued to struggle, and their children were often the ones who paid the price. These children were still vulnerable to exploitation, even as society attempted to improve their working conditions. In the mid-20th century, there were more calls for the eradication of poverty and for the government to take a more active role in supporting poor families. Welfare programs, such as unemployment benefits, housing support, and child allowances, were introduced to assist families who were struggling to make ends meet. These programs helped reduce the burden on children, enabling them to attend school instead of working to support their families. However, the cycle of poverty is persistent, and many children still face challenges that hindered their opportunities. As we entered the 21st century, the legacy of the Victorian reformers continued to shape the policies and systems that protect children today. Though child labor has largely been eradicated in the developed world, children in developing countries still face exploitation, particularly in sweatshops, mines, and conflict zones. However, the lessons learned from the struggles of poor Victorian children and the reforms that followed continue to inspire advocates and policymakers around the globe. The battle for children's rights, however, is far from over. While the Victorian era's reforms created the foundation for the modern child protection system, the fight for equality continues. Children around the world still face significant obstacles, from poverty and violence to lack of education and health care. But as the Victorian reformers showed, change is possible, and the resilience of children continues to be a driving force for progress. Their fight for justice has sparked a global movement that advocates for every child to have the chance to grow, learn, and succeed. As the Victorian era gave way to the 20th century, the reforms that had been slowly taking shape began to have a more lasting impact on the lives of poor children in London and beyond. The Factory Acts, the rise of public education, and the gradual improvements in living conditions had laid the groundwork for a future where children's rights were better protected. However, while these changes were significant, the road to full protection and opportunity for every child was far from smooth. The early efforts of reformers set the stage for the continuing struggle for children's welfare, but it would take decades for these reforms to be fully realized. One of the most lasting changes to come out of the Victorian reform movements was the expansion of education. The Education Act of 1870, which had made education for children up to the age of 13 compulsory, was a landmark piece of legislation, but its effects were not fully felt until the early 20th century. The law had established the framework for universal education, but it was still up to local authorities to implement it, and many poor children continued to receive inadequate schooling. The quality of education varied greatly depending on where children lived, and many working-class children were still required to work in factories, mines, or on the streets. However, as the century progressed, more and more children began to attend school. The Education Act of 1918, also known as the Fisher Act, further expanded on the work of its predecessors by increasing the school-leaving age to 14 and improving the curriculum for working-class children. This shift allowed more children, especially those from poorer families, to receive a better education, paving the way for greater opportunities later in life. Children were no longer expected to contribute to the family income at such an early age, and many began to move away from factory labor and towards skilled work and trades that required an education. At the same time, the early 20th century saw the establishment of more comprehensive child welfare programs. The Children's Charter of 1908, which had created juvenile courts and reinforced the idea that children were not miniature adults but individuals with special needs, was expanded in the early 1900s. The Children's Act of 1948 further solidified the role of social workers and the state in protecting children from neglect, abuse, and exploitation. This was a major milestone in child protection law, but it was rooted in the efforts of Victorian reformers who had worked to raise awareness about the need for child welfare laws. The rise of the welfare state in the aftermath of the Second World War had a profound effect on children's lives. The creation of the National Health Service, NHS, in 1948 ensured that all children, regardless of their family's financial status, had access to free health care. Before this, poor children were often left untreated for sicknesses and diseases, with many dying from preventable causes. The introduction of vaccinations and better hygiene standards, alongside improved medical care, led to a dramatic reduction in child mortality. This was a direct result of the earlier reforms, which had highlighted the extreme vulnerability of children and pushed for societal change. By the time the 1960s and 1970s rolled around, the social safety nets created in the Victorian era were deeply entrenched. Laws concerning child labor had largely eradicated the practice in most industries, and the overwhelming focus shifted toward children's rights. The United Nations adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, in 1989 was an international recognition of the progress made in child welfare. The CRC outlined the basic rights of children worldwide, including the right to education, protection from abuse, and participation in decisions that affect their lives. Though the Victorian reforms had been national in scope, the CRC set a global standard for children's protection that influenced laws and policies across the world. The foundation laid by the Victorian reformers also influenced the rise of social movements in the 20th century. As industrialization continued, the plight of the poor, especially children, remained at the forefront of many political debates. Movements advocating for workers' rights, equal education, and equal access to health care drew upon the work of earlier reformers who had fought for children's rights. While child labor had been officially abolished in most industries, exploitation continued in other forms, such as child trafficking and the use of children in war. These new forms of exploitation led to the development of international human rights frameworks that focused specifically on the welfare of children, continuing the fight for equality and justice that began in the Victorian era. The reformers of the Victorian era were also the pioneers of the idea that poverty and social inequality were factors that contributed to the exploitation of children. The education reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries helped to break the cycle of poverty by giving children the tools they needed to lift themselves out of it. But even as education became more accessible, the issue of poverty remained a serious problem. Families who lived in slums or had low-paying jobs continued to struggle, and their children were often the ones who paid the price. These children were still vulnerable to exploitation, even as society attempted to improve their working conditions. In the mid-20th century, there were more calls for the eradication of poverty, and for the government to take a more active role in supporting poor families. Welfare programs, such as unemployment benefits, housing support, and child allowances, were introduced to assist families who were struggling to make ends meet. These programs helped reduce the burden on children, enabling them to attend school instead of working to support their families. However, the cycle of poverty is persistent, and many children still face challenges that hindered their opportunities. As we entered the 21st century, the legacy of the Victorian reformers continued to shape the policies and systems that protect children today. Though child labor has largely been eradicated in the developed world, children in developing countries still face exploitation, particularly in sweatshops, mines, and conflict zones. However, the lessons learned from the struggles of poor Victorian children and the reforms that followed continue to inspire advocates and policymakers around the globe. The battle for children's rights, however, is far from over. While the Victorian era's reforms created the foundation for the modern child protection system, the fight for equality continues. Children around the world still face significant obstacles, from poverty and violence to lack of education and healthcare. But as the Victorian reformers showed, change is possible, and the resilience of children continues to be a driving force for progress. Their fight for justice has sparked a global movement that advocates for every child to have the chance to grow, learn, and succeed. As we look toward the future of child protection, it's clear that the legacy of Victorian-era reforms has paved the way for significant progress in child welfare. However, despite the advancements, there are still many challenges to overcome. The work of Victorian reformers, who fought for the rights of children, has created the foundation for the modern child protection system. But these systems must continue to evolve to address the complex issues facing children today. In the 21st century, the landscape of child exploitation has changed significantly from the days of factory work and chimney sweeping. However, new forms of exploitation have emerged, particularly in response to the globalized economy and the digital revolution. While child labor remains a serious issue in parts of the world, children are increasingly being exploited in other ways, such as child trafficking, online abuse, and child soldiers. These issues present unique challenges that the current child protection system must address in innovative ways. One of the most pressing challenges in the fight for children's rights is the continued existence of child labor in many parts of the world. Despite significant progress in eliminating child labor in industrialized nations, it remains widespread in developing countries, particularly in sectors like agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. Children working in these industries often face dangerous working conditions, exploitation, and abuse. The International Labor Organization, ILO, has estimated that nearly 152 million children are still engaged in child labor worldwide, with the vast majority working in agriculture. Many of these children are exposed to toxic chemicals, dangerous machinery, and physical abuse from employers. To address this issue, global cooperation is essential. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, include a target to eradicate child labor by 2025. However, achieving this goal requires stronger enforcement of existing laws and the introduction of more comprehensive protections for children. Governments, international organizations, and businesses must work together to ensure that supply chains are free from child labor and that alternative education opportunities are provided to children who might otherwise be forced into work. Companies can play a critical role by ensuring that they do not source products from regions where child labor is prevalent, and by taking responsibility for ensuring that their business practices do not contribute to exploitation. Another growing challenge for child protection is the digital age, which has created new avenues for exploitation and abuse. The rise of social media, online gaming, and digital communication has brought about new forms of online grooming, cyberbullying, and sexual exploitation. Children, especially those in vulnerable situations, are increasingly exposed to risks in the online world. Online predators can exploit social media platforms, chat rooms, and gaming apps to groom children for sexual exploitation or trafficking. The digital divide also plays a role in this challenge. While access to technology can be a powerful tool for learning and development, it can also expose children to harmful content and individuals. In many parts of the world, children may be unaware of the dangers posed by the internet, leaving them vulnerable to online predators. Governments and tech companies must work together to create safer online environments for children, implementing stricter regulations on social media platforms and online games. Additionally, digital literacy programs must be expanded to ensure that children are educated about the potential risks of the online world and how to protect themselves. To protect children in the digital age, national governments must enforce stricter cybersecurity laws, regulate online platforms, and implement programs to raise awareness of the dangers of online exploitation. Many countries are already taking steps in this direction. For example, The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, includes provisions to protect children's personal data, and the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, in the United States, aims to protect children under the age of 13 from online exploitation. However, these laws must be updated regularly to keep pace with the rapid evolution of technology. Furthermore, the problem of child soldiers continues to plague many parts of the world. Armed conflicts in countries like Syria, South Sudan, Yemen, and the Central African Republic have led to the recruitment and use of children as soldiers, often by force or coercion. These children are subjected to extreme violence, abuse, and trauma, and many are left scarred for life. The use of child soldiers violates international law, and the United Nations has repeatedly called for stronger action to end the practice. While progress has been made in some regions, particularly through the demobilization programs that aim to reintegrate former child soldiers back into society, the problem remains widespread. International organizations like Save the Children and Amnesty International have advocated for stronger peacekeeping efforts and for accountability for those who recruit and use child soldiers. As a global community, we must continue to pressure governments to end the practice of child soldier recruitment and provide recovery and reintegration programs for children who have been forced into armed conflict. One of the key lessons learned from the past is that education is one of the most effective tools for protecting children and breaking the cycle of exploitation. Access to education not only empowers children to escape the clutches of poverty and labor, but also provides them with the knowledge and skills to protect themselves from exploitation. In many parts of the world, children are still denied access to education, particularly girls, who are often kept out of school due to cultural norms, poverty, or early marriage. The global education movement has made strides in addressing these disparities. The UNESCO Education for Sustainable Development and the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, are two key organizations working to ensure that every child has access to quality education. However, much more needs to be done to ensure that children in conflict zones, refugee camps, and marginalized communities are not left behind. In addition to providing basic education, governments must focus on improving the quality of education. Many children in developing countries are enrolled in school but receive inadequate instruction due to overcrowded classrooms, underpaid teachers, and outdated curricula. By investing in the training of teachers, ensuring access to learning materials, and expanding access to technology, we can ensure that children are given the tools they need to succeed and protect themselves from exploitation. Another essential component of child protection is the establishment of robust social safety nets. The welfare state, which emerged in the mid-20th century, has provided crucial support for vulnerable children and families. Programs such as child allowances, health care, and subsidized housing help reduce the economic pressures on families, ensuring that children are not forced into labor to survive. Governments must continue to invest in these programs and ensure that they reach the most vulnerable children. Lastly, the role of community-based organizations and local activism cannot be overstated. While international treaties and national laws are important, the grassroots movements that emerge within communities are often the most effective in driving change. Local organizations can provide direct support to children at risk, offer education and training, and advocate for changes in policy at the national level. In conclusion, while the Victorian era's reforms laid the groundwork for modern child protection systems, there is still much to be done. The challenges of child labor, online exploitation, child soldiers, and lack of access to education continue to affect millions of children around the world. However, the efforts of global organizations, governments, and individuals committed to protecting children's rights are beginning to make a difference. By continuing the work that began with the reformers of the Victorian era, we can create a world where all children are free from exploitation, where they have access to quality education, and where their rights are protected and respected. As we continue our journey through the history of child welfare, it's crucial to reflect on the long-term impact of the reforms initiated during the Victorian era and how they have shaped modern society's view of children. The transformation from a time when children were treated as laborers or property to a time when they are recognized as individuals with rights has been one of the most profound shifts in social and legal systems worldwide. While the road to achieving children's rights has been long and full of challenges, the lasting effects of the Victorian child labor reforms continue to resonate in the laws and policies that protect children today. At the heart of this transformation is the recognition that children are not miniature adults. They are individuals with unique needs, vulnerabilities, and the right to grow and develop in a safe and supportive environment. Over the past century, societal attitudes toward children have evolved significantly, largely thanks to the tireless work of reformers in the Victorian era and the subsequent child welfare movements. This shift in perspective has had profound effects on how children are treated, both legally and socially. One of the most notable long-term effects of Victorian reforms is the widespread acceptance of children's rights. During the Victorian era, children were primarily seen as workers or property that contributed to the household economy. They were often viewed through a utilitarian lens, with little regard for their emotional, physical, or educational needs. This mindset began to shift thanks to the work of reformers like Charles Dickens, Lord Shaftesbury, and Dr. Shory Norris, Richard Peters, who recognized that children were not merely tools to be used for labor, but were individuals who deserved care, protection, and education. The establishment of laws, such as the Factory Acts, Education Acts, and the Children's Charter, marked the beginning of a shift toward recognizing the inherent rights of children. By the time we entered the 20th century, these reforms were increasingly codified into national and international laws that defined children as individuals with rights to education, health care, protection from exploitation, and participation in society. The United Nations played a key role in expanding this recognition globally. In 1959, the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child established 10 principles designed to ensure the well-being of children around the world. These principles emphasized the importance of education, protection from abuse, and the right to play and grow in a safe environment. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, adopted in 1989, further expanded these principles, laying out comprehensive rights for children to live in dignity, freedom, and equality. With almost every country in the world ratifying the CRC, this treaty became the cornerstone of modern child protection and children's rights advocacy. As societal views on children shifted, so too did the legal landscape. One of the most significant changes was the shift from viewing children as property to recognizing them as individuals with rights. In the Victorian era, children were often treated as chattel, to be worked or disciplined as their parents saw fit. Today, children are seen as individuals who must be protected and nurtured in order to reach their full potential. This change has been reflected in laws that place the best interests of the child as the paramount consideration in decisions affecting them. The establishment of juvenile courts, child protection services, and education systems have all been integral in shaping the modern conception of childhood as a time of development and growth, not just survival. The impact of these reforms can be seen in the growth of child protection systems. Child welfare organizations and governmental agencies are now dedicated to ensuring that children are protected from abuse, neglect, exploitation, and violence. These systems are designed to intervene when children are at risk and to provide support and care for those who need it. Social workers, child advocacy groups, and law enforcement agencies play an essential role in this system, working together to protect children and hold accountable those who violate their rights. Additionally, these changes have led to significant improvements in access to education for children worldwide. The Victorian reforms, such as the Education Acts, set the stage for the global recognition of education as a fundamental right. Today, education is not just a privilege for the wealthy, but a right for every child, regardless of their socioeconomic background. The development of compulsory education laws in many countries has drastically increased literacy rates and provided opportunities for children to escape the cycle of poverty and exploitation that defined the Victorian era. However, even with these significant achievements, there are still numerous challenges in ensuring that all children have equal access to education and protection. Despite global laws and international treaties, children in many parts of the world still face poverty, exploitation, and violence. According to the UNICEF, nearly 260 million children worldwide are still out of school, and child labor continues to be a significant issue in many developing countries. The persistence of child trafficking, child marriage, and the use of child soldiers also remains a deeply troubling issue. For instance, in regions where conflict is rampant, children are often recruited by armed groups and forced to fight as soldiers. The impact of this exploitation is devastating, with children subjected to violence, trauma, and often death. International organizations such as the UNICEF, Save the Children, and Amnesty International continue to advocate for stronger protections for these children and work to demobilize child soldiers and reintegrate them into society. The legacy of the Victorian-era child labor reform movements, which laid the groundwork for child protection laws, continues to fuel these global efforts. Another challenge remains the digital exploitation of children in the age of the internet. With the rapid growth of the digital world, children are increasingly vulnerable to online grooming, cyberbullying, and sexual exploitation. Many children, especially those in vulnerable situations, are at risk of being preyed upon by online predators. The rise of social media platforms, online gaming, and interactive content has introduced new challenges for child protection, requiring governments and technology companies to collaborate on creating safer online environments. Cybersecurity laws and digital literacy programs are essential tools in the fight to protect children in the digital world. However, despite these challenges, the progress made over the past century is undeniable. The Victorian-era reforms sparked a worldwide movement for children's rights that has created systems of protection, support, and opportunity for children in many parts of the world. These reforms have helped to create a society where children are no longer seen as mere laborers or property, but as individuals who have the right to protection, care, education, and a future. The work of those early reformers has shaped modern child protection systems, and the fight for children's rights continues to inspire change today. In conclusion, while much progress has been made since the Victorian era, the fight for children's rights is far from over. Children today still face many of the same challenges their Victorian counterparts did: poverty, exploitation, abuse, and lack of education. However, the legacy of the Victorian-era reforms and the global recognition of children's rights provide a strong foundation for continued progress. Governments, NGOs, advocacy groups, and communities must continue to work together to protect and support children, ensuring that the promise of a better future, free from exploitation and abuse, becomes a reality for every child in the world. Through the Victorian reforms, the challenges that children face today are not entirely different from those endured by their historical counterparts. Children in different parts of the world continue to grapple with poverty, exploitation, lack of education, and abuse. However, global initiatives, modern child protection systems, and international collaborations continue to work tirelessly toward improving the lives of the most vulnerable children. One of the most important developments in global child welfare has been the rise of international collaboration. The United Nations, UN, UNICEF, and a host of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, are at the forefront of efforts to protect children worldwide. These organizations not only provide direct aid to children in need, but also serve as powerful advocates for policy changes and the implementation of international child welfare standards. UNICEF and Global Child Protection, one of the most impactful international organizations working to protect children's rights, is UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. Since its founding in 1946, UNICEF has been a central player in improving child health, education, nutrition, and protection worldwide. UNICEF's work spans across continents, tackling issues ranging from malnutrition and disease prevention to child labor and child marriage. In particular, UNICEF's Global Child Protection Program has been instrumental in addressing the widespread issue of child exploitation. They focus on eliminating the worst forms of child labor, protecting children from trafficking, and ensuring that every child can grow up in a safe and nurturing environment. UNICEF's advocacy for education has helped bring attention to the fact that access to education is not just a privilege for wealthy children, but a fundamental human right for all children, especially those in conflict zones or underprivileged regions. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, which was adopted by the UN in 1989, forms the foundation of UNICEF's mission. The CRC ensures that every child is entitled to the protection of their basic rights, including the right to education, healthcare, protection from violence and exploitation, and participation in decisions that affect their lives. The CRC has been ratified by almost every country, providing a powerful, binding legal framework for child protection. Despite this success, UNICEF's work remains crucial as challenges persist in areas such as child labor, violence against children, child trafficking, and the lack of quality education for millions of children, especially girls. UNICEF continues to provide emergency relief in regions affected by natural disasters, armed conflict, and refugee crises, as well as advocating for policies that prioritize child welfare and human rights. Modern legal protections and global initiatives. In addition to the work of UNICEF and similar organizations, national governments have increasingly recognized the importance of legal protections for children. The establishment of child protection laws and the creation of systems for juvenile justice have been instrumental in ensuring that children are treated with the care and respect they deserve. Today, many countries have child protection agencies dedicated to investigating cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. One of the key developments in modern child welfare law has been the establishment of juvenile justice systems that treat children as individuals with distinct needs. These systems are designed to provide rehabilitation and education rather than punishment, acknowledging that children are still developing both mentally and emotionally. Juvenile justice systems also aim to divert young offenders from the criminal justice system and provide support services, such as counseling and education, to help children reintegrate into society. However, these systems still face significant challenges. Poverty, discrimination, and lack of access to quality education continue to feed the cycle of youth incarceration. While many juvenile systems are designed to help children, disparities in resources, lack of consistency, and bias in the justice system often result in children from marginalized communities being disproportionately affected. In the 21st century, international organizations like the World Bank, UNICEF, and the International Labor Organization, ILO, have worked with governments to improve child labor laws globally. The ILO Convention Number 182, which focuses on the worst forms of child labor, including slavery, trafficking, and child soldier recruitment, has played a critical role in driving efforts to eliminate harmful child labor. However, despite these laws, global supply chains in industries such as textiles, mining, and agriculture often continue to exploit children, particularly in developing countries. Child rights in the digital age. The rise of digital technology has created both new opportunities and new dangers for children. The internet and social media have opened up global communication and educational opportunities, but have also created significant risks for children's safety. Cyberbullying, online exploitation, grooming, and access to harmful content are just a few of the issues that children face in the digital world. The digital age has introduced complex challenges for child protection, as online predators can exploit children through social media platforms, online gaming, and even streaming services. Governments and tech companies have started to respond to these new challenges, with laws aimed at creating safer digital environments for children. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, in the European Union includes provisions to protect children's personal data, while the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA, in the United States restricts how companies can collect and use data from children under the age of 13. Additionally, the rise of digital literacy programs has become a key tool in educating children and parents about the risks of the internet and how to navigate online spaces safely. However, challenges remain in ensuring that children in low-resource areas have access to the tools and knowledge they need to protect themselves from online risks. As technology evolves rapidly, it is essential that laws and regulations adapt to the changing landscape of digital threats. Challenges in addressing child marriage and gender inequality. Child marriage remains a significant issue worldwide, with millions of girls being married off before they reach the age of 18. In many countries, particularly in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, cultural norms, poverty, and lack of education perpetuate the practice of child marriage. This practice denies girls the right to an education, subjects them to domestic violence, and severely limits their opportunities for future growth. The global community, through organizations like UNICEF and Girls Not Brides, has made strides in raising awareness and advocating for laws that prohibit child marriage. However, the practice remains prevalent in many countries, especially in rural and marginalized communities. The fight against child marriage requires not only laws and policies, but also cultural change, as communities must be educated about the dangers of early marriage and the importance of empowering girls through education and economic opportunity. The role of NGOs and grassroots movements. While international organizations and governments play a critical role in protecting children, grassroots movements and local NGOs are often the unsung heroes of the child welfare movement. Local child advocacy groups work tirelessly on the ground to provide resources, raise awareness, and advocate for policy changes at the community level. They often work directly with children who are at risk and provide them with the support they need to survive and thrive. These organizations also play an essential role in monitoring child protection issues, holding governments accountable, and filling the gaps left by larger institutions. The global movement for children's rights is a collective effort. Everyone, from policymakers to community leaders to individuals, has a role to play in ensuring that every child's rights are respected and protected. The fight for children's rights is a continuing battle that requires constant vigilance, advocacy, and collaboration across borders. In conclusion, the modern world faces many challenges in ensuring the protection and rights of children. While the Victorian-era reforms laid the foundation for the progress we have made, the issues children face today are complex and evolving. As we move forward, it is essential to continue building on these early reforms, ensuring that children everywhere have the opportunity to grow, learn, and live in a safe, equitable, and nurturing environment. The work of the past and the progress of the present must continue to inspire us to fight for the rights of every child, because the future belongs to them. As we reach the final part of our journey through the history of child welfare, it's crucial to focus on how child protection and children's rights advocacy must evolve in response to the challenges of the modern world. The progress that has been made over the past centuries, from the Victorian reforms to the global conventions and modern protections we have today, serves as a strong foundation. However, as the world continues to change, so too must our efforts to ensure that every child's rights are respected and upheld. In the 21st century, we face an entirely new set of challenges: globalization, the digital revolution, and climate change, all present unique threats to children's well-being. Despite the efforts of UNICEF, NGOs, and governments to protect children, many still face exploitation, violence, and neglect. Child labor, child trafficking, early marriage, sexual exploitation, and digital abuse are all pressing issues that require urgent attention. So what can we do to continue advocating for children's rights and creating a world where every child is safe, protected, and able to reach their full potential? Advocacy through education, the power of awareness. One of the most powerful tools in advancing child welfare is education. Just as Victorian reformers used literature, reports, and media to raise awareness about the plight of children, today's advocates can leverage digital platforms, social media, and public campaigns to continue spreading the message of children's rights. Public awareness is crucial in the fight against child labor, child trafficking, and abuse, as it often leads to community action and government intervention. The power of education cannot be overstated. Children, parents, and communities must understand the importance of children's rights and the resources available to protect them. Education programs aimed at both adults and children can teach self-protection, digital literacy, and the dangers of child exploitation. Governments and NGOs need to expand these programs, especially in underdeveloped or marginalized regions, where children are particularly vulnerable. Digital literacy programs are especially important in today's digital age, where children are exposed to online abuse and grooming. As the internet becomes more integrated into children's daily lives, it is crucial that children are educated about how to protect themselves online and recognize online dangers. Empowering children with knowledge about privacy, safe communication, and how to report abuse is an essential step in preventing online exploitation. Legal reforms and strengthening protection laws. While education plays a crucial role, Legal reforms are at the heart of creating lasting change for children. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, has provided a global framework for child protection, but there is still much work to be done to ensure that its provisions are fully implemented. Countries that have ratified the CRC must continue to strengthen and enforce child protection laws, ensuring that they adequately address the evolving risks children face today. One area that requires continued attention is child labor. Despite international laws and agreements like ILO Convention number 182 and the CRC, child labor is still widespread, particularly in developing countries. The global supply chain has often been complicit in perpetuating exploitative child labor, particularly in industries such as mining, agriculture, and textile manufacturing. Governments must take stronger action to regulate industries and hold businesses accountable for ensuring that their operations do not exploit children. Similarly, child trafficking and sexual exploitation continue to be pervasive problems. Despite legal frameworks like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the United States and similar laws around the world, traffickers still find ways to exploit vulnerable children for forced labor, sexual exploitation, and child prostitution. International collaboration between governments, law enforcement, and NGOs is essential in combating trafficking networks and ensuring that those who exploit children are held accountable. The establishment of family courts, juvenile justice systems, and child welfare agencies over the last century has been a major milestone in protecting children. These systems must continue to evolve to meet the needs of children in the digital age, providing comprehensive services to those who face abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Additionally, these systems should be accessible and effective in marginalized communities where children are at greatest risk. Tackling poverty and gender inequality, another critical aspect of protecting children, is addressing poverty and gender inequality, which continue to undermine children's rights across the globe. Children who grow up in poverty are more likely to suffer from malnutrition, lack of education, and exploitation. Poverty forces many children into child labor, early marriage, and dangerous work environments simply to survive. The eradication of child poverty is a global challenge, but it is one that can be tackled through coordinated efforts. Social welfare programs, including child allowances, universal health care, and subsidized housing, must be expanded to ensure that all families, especially those in poverty, can meet their children's needs. Governments must work to provide economic opportunities for families, ensuring that parents have access to decent jobs and livable wages so that their children can be freed from the cycle of exploitation. Gender inequality also continues to be a major barrier to children's rights. Girls, in particular, are disproportionately affected by child marriage, sexual exploitation, and lack of education. In many parts of the world, girls are denied the opportunity to go to school and are married off at a young age, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and discrimination. Addressing gender inequality requires both legislative change and cultural transformation. Governments, international organizations, and local communities must work together to empower girls, ensure they have access to education, and protect them from harmful cultural practices. Strengthening global partnerships and advocacy. The fight for children's rights is a global effort, and international collaboration remains essential to creating a world where every child is protected and empowered. Partnerships between governments, NGOs, civil society organizations, and businesses are critical in ensuring that the needs of children are met. International initiatives like the Global Partnership for Education and the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are examples of efforts to ensure that education and child welfare are at the center of global development. One of the key strategies for advancing children's rights is advocacy. Organizations like Save the Children, World Vision, and Plan International continue to advocate for policy changes at the local, national, and international levels. Through public campaigns, lobbying efforts, and awareness-raising activities, these organizations bring attention to the issues that matter most to children and push for meaningful change. In the future, digital advocacy will become increasingly important. The rise of social media, crowdfunding, and digital platforms provides new opportunities for child welfare advocates to reach a global audience and mobilize action. Youth-led movements can also play an important role in advancing children's rights as the next generation of leaders becomes increasingly active and advocating for the issues that affect them and their peers. The role of the individual. How you can make a difference. While international organizations and governments have an essential role to play in the fight for children's rights, individual actions matter too. Each of us can make a difference in the lives of children by supporting child welfare organizations, raising awareness about children's rights, and advocating for policy changes in our communities. Supporting charities and NGOs that focus on children's rights, volunteering at local shelters, and educating others about the importance of protecting children can all contribute to making a positive impact. Moreover, advocating for children's rights in our daily lives is an important step in creating a world where all children are respected. Whether through raising awareness on social media, speaking out against exploitation, or supporting legislative changes in your community, each small action contributes to a larger movement for change. In conclusion, the fight for children's rights is far from over. The progress made in the past century, beginning with the Victorian reforms, has provided a foundation for the child protection systems we have today. However, new challenges continue to arise in a globalized and digitally connected world. By continuing to advocate for children's rights, strengthening legal protections, addressing poverty and inequality, and collaborating globally, we can create a world where every child is safe, protected, and given the opportunity to thrive. As we reach the final part of our journey through the history of child welfare, it's crucial to focus on how child protection and children's rights advocacy must evolve in response to the challenges of the modern world. The progress that has been made over the past centuries, from the Victorian reforms to the global conventions and modern protections we have today, serves as a strong foundation. However, as the world continues to change, so too must our efforts to ensure that every child's rights are respected and upheld. In the 21st century, we face an entirely new set of challenges. Globalization, the digital revolution, and climate change all present unique threats to children's well-being. Despite the efforts of UNICEF, NGOs, and governments to protect children, many still face exploitation, violence, and neglect. Child labor, child trafficking, early marriage, sexual exploitation, and digital abuse are all pressing issues that require urgent attention. So what can we do to continue advocating for children's rights and creating a world where every child is safe, protected, and able to reach their full potential? Advocacy through education. The power of awareness. One of the most powerful tools in advancing child welfare is education. Just as Victorian reformers used literature, reports, and media to raise awareness about the plight of children, today's advocates can leverage digital platforms, social media, and public campaigns to continue spreading the message of children's rights. Public awareness is crucial in the fight against child labor, child trafficking, and abuse, as it often leads to community action and government intervention. The power of education cannot be overstated. Children, parents, and communities must understand the importance of children's rights and the resources available to protect them. Education programs aimed at both adults and children can teach self-protection, digital literacy, and the dangers of child exploitation. Governments and NGOs need to expand these programs, especially in underdeveloped or marginalized regions where children are particularly vulnerable. Digital literacy programs are especially important in today's digital age, where children are exposed to online abuse and grooming. As the internet becomes more integrated into children's daily lives, it is crucial that children are educated about how to protect themselves online and recognize online dangers. Empowering children with knowledge about privacy, safe communication, and how to report abuse is an essential step in preventing online exploitation. Legal reforms and strengthening protection laws. While education plays a crucial role, legal reforms are at the heart of creating lasting change for children. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC, has provided a global framework for child protection, but there is still much work to be done to ensure that its provisions are fully implemented. Countries that have ratified the CRC must continue to strengthen and enforce child protection laws, ensuring that they adequately address the evolving risks children face today. One area that requires continued attention is child labor. Despite international laws and agreements like ILO Convention No. 182 and the CRC, child labor is still widespread. particularly in developing countries. The global supply chain has often been complicit in perpetuating exploitative child labor, particularly in industries such as mining, agriculture, and textile manufacturing. Governments must take stronger action to regulate industries and hold businesses accountable for ensuring that their operations do not exploit children. Similarly, child trafficking and sexual exploitation continue to be pervasive problems. Despite legal frameworks like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the United States and similar laws around the world, traffickers still find ways to exploit vulnerable children for forced labor, sexual exploitation, and child prostitution. International collaboration between governments, law enforcement, and NGOs is essential in combating trafficking networks and ensuring that those who exploit children are held accountable. The establishment of family courts, juvenile justice systems, and child welfare agencies over the last century has been a major milestone in protecting children. These systems must continue to evolve to meet the needs of children in the digital age, providing comprehensive services to those who face abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Additionally, these systems should be accessible and effective in marginalized communities where children are at greatest risk. Tackling poverty and gender inequality. Another critical aspect of protecting children is addressing poverty and gender inequality, which continue to undermine children's rights across the globe. Children who grow up in poverty are more likely to suffer from malnutrition, lack of education, and exploitation. Poverty forces many children into child labor, early marriage, and dangerous work environments simply to survive. The eradication of child poverty is a global challenge, but it is one that can be tackled through coordinated efforts. Social welfare programs, including child allowances, universal health care, and subsidized housing, must be expanded to ensure that all families, especially those in poverty, can meet their children's needs. Governments must work to provide economic opportunities for families, ensuring that parents have access to decent jobs and livable wages, so that their children can be freed from the cycle of exploitation. Gender inequality also continues to be a major barrier to children's rights. Girls, in particular, are disproportionately affected by child marriage, sexual exploitation, and lack of education. In many parts of the world, girls are denied the opportunity to go to school and are married off at a young age, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and discrimination. Addressing gender inequality requires both legislative change and cultural transformation. Governments, international organizations, and local communities must work together to empower girls, ensure they have access to education, and protect them from harmful cultural practices. Strengthening global partnerships and advocacy. The fight for children's rights is a global effort, and international collaboration remains essential to creating a world where every child is protected and empowered. Partnerships between governments, NGOs, civil society organizations, and businesses are critical in ensuring that the needs of children are met. International initiatives, like the Global Partnership for Education and the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are examples of efforts to ensure that education and child welfare are at the center of global development. One of the key strategies for advancing children's rights is advocacy. Organizations like Save the Children, World Vision, and Plan International continue to advocate for policy changes at the local, national, and international levels. Through public campaigns, lobbying efforts, and awareness-raising activities, these organizations bring attention to the issues that matter most to children and push for meaningful change. In the future, digital advocacy will become increasingly important. The rise of social media, crowdfunding, and digital platforms provides new opportunities for child welfare advocates to reach a global audience and mobilize action. Youth-led movements can also play an important role in advancing children's rights, as the next generation of leaders becomes increasingly active in advocating for the issues that affect them and their peers. The role of the individual, how you can make a difference. While international organizations and governments have an essential role to play in the fight for children's rights, individual actions matter too. Each of us can make a difference in the lives of children by supporting child welfare organizations, raising awareness about children's rights, and advocating for policy changes in our communities. Supporting charities and NGOs that focus on children's rights, volunteering at local shelters, and educating others about the importance of protecting children can all contribute to making a positive impact. Moreover, advocating for children's rights in our daily lives is an important step in creating a world where all children are respected. Whether through raising awareness on social media, speaking out against exploitation, or supporting legislative changes in your community, each small action contributes to a larger movement for change. In conclusion, the fight for children's rights is far from over. The progress made in the past century, beginning with the Victorian reforms, has provided a foundation for the child protection systems we have today. However, new challenges continue to arise in a globalized and digitally connected world. By continuing to advocate for children's rights, strengthening legal protections, addressing poverty and inequality, and collaborating globally, we can create a world where every child is safe, protected, and given the opportunity to thrive. Good night. And may the stories of resilience and advocacy for children inspire you as you rest, knowing that the work continues for a brighter, more just future for every child.